It was a plain email. No greeting, no warmth, just a few lines typed beneath Na's signature, sent from her iPhone. The subject line read, "Holiday Plans." I stared at it for a full minute before opening it, even though I already knew not a call from my son, not even a voice memo, just that flat screen glow with a message that felt more like a calendar alert than an invitation for someone who had once wrapped his birthday gifts in hand-up-painted paper and baked 3 cakes because he couldn't decide on a flavor. This moment landed harder than it should have. I wonder if any of you have ever read a message so short, yet felt something in your chest pull just a little bit tighter. That quiet tug, the kind that says, "You're no longer part of the story." The message read, "Christmas dinner will be at our house again this year. Around 5, hope you can come." No signature, no love, no mention of my name, just that one word. Hope, like it was optional. Like I was optional. It hadn't come from Garrett. It came from Nana. That stung more than I admitted my son. And I used to talk every Sunday. Even if it was just 10 minutes now. I got monthly texts, and even those felt like receipts. Still, I sat with it. I reread it. I stared out the window at the bare trees, losing their fight against the wind, and even after all that, I replied, "Thank you, I'll be there." I typed it slowly, carefully, like the words might break if I pressed too hard. I didn't ask if they needed anything. I didn't offer to bring food or help set up. I knew better by now. I'd been slowly taught where the line was, and this time I wasn't going to trip over it, trying to make things easier for them. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair for a moment. I wondered what it would feel like if Garrett had called me himself, if he had said, "Mom, I really want you there." But those kinds of thoughts don't help. They only scratch at old scabs. The clock ticked loud in the quiet. I glanced toward the corner cabinet where a box of decorations still sat unopened. I hadn't bothered yet. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. The invitation was cold, but I was still going because sometimes even when the door barely opens, we still walk through it, hoping something inside might be warmer than the way we were asked to come. I started with the mulling spices, not because they were necessary, but because the smell reminded me of winters, when Garrett was still small enough to curl up beside me on the couch with a book. Cinnamon and orange peel always brought him running to the kitchen, asking what was baking. Back then, I never minded the interruptions. These days, the kitchen stayed quiet even when full. I opened the pantry and pulled out the mason jars. I had saved the last of the summer blueberries, preserved them the way my mother taught me. I added a hint of nutmeg and lemon zest and cooked the batch slow. One small jar would go in the gift bag tied with red twine and a handwritten label. The label was the important part I had written. From my kitchen, always with love. Next came the photo album. I had started collecting the pictures months ago, not for any particular reason. Just something to do when the house felt too still. Garrett's first Christmas, his missing front teeth. The costume he wore for second-grade nativity. I arranged the pages carefully, alternating photos with small notes not to impress anyone, but to preserve something only I remembered. I paused when I reached the photo of us at the lake. He was 10, wrapped in a towel, laughing with chocolate on his face. I had taken that photo just after he fell off the paddleboard and said he'd never try again. He had tried again the next morning. That was who he used to be, resilient, sweet. Still unsure, but open, I slipped the photo into the plastic sleeve, then slid the album into a cloth bag with a stitched snowflake beside it. I tucked the jar of preserves and the folded letter I had written on stationery. Garrett gave me 5 Christmases ago. It was pale green with a gold border, the kind that made even simple. Words feel important. I didn't write much, just enough to say that I hoped we would share more than space this year, that I missed the sound of him laughing without looking over his shoulder, that even now I still believed in second chances. The bag wasn't big. It wouldn't stand out under a glittering tree, but it carried 30 years of winter mornings, scraped knees, late-night school projects, and quiet prayers whispered through closed doors. I placed it by the front door, ready for the next morning. Even if I wasn't sure how I'd be received, I wanted to arrive holding something that reminded me of who I was. Not just Garrett's mother, but someone who remembered how to love, even when the love wasn't. Returned, the sky had turned a soft, steely gray by the time I pulled into their neighborhood. Snow was already beginning to gather along the edges of the driveway, thin white veins stretching across the sidewalk. I parked by the curb and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle for a moment. Their house looked warm from the outside. Light glowed in the windows, flickering across the front room like a fireplace might be going. I could hear laughter, faint but clear, rising above soft Christmas music. Someone was clinking glasses. A child's voice squealed with delight. It all sounded lovely, almost like I was welcome. I gathered my gift bag from the passenger seat, made sure the album was still tucked inside. Safely, my gloves were in my coat pocket, but I didn't put them on. My hands were shaking and I needed to feel the cold. The walk up the drive felt longer than I remembered. I passed the familiar row of hedges Garrett used to help trim in the summer, the ones I bought after he first moved in to add curb appeal. They looked the same, just dusted in white, now, brittle and bare. I climbed the steps, slowly, careful on the ice. The doorbell was new, sleek, digital. I pressed it once. A soft chime rang inside. Then nothing. I waited, no footsteps, no shadow behind the glass, just more laughter in the background. I rang. Again, this time I leaned forward, listening closer still. Nothing. I stepped back and glanced around. My boots were beginning to soak through snow, caught in the cuffs of my pants. The bag in my hand started to sag under the weight of moisture. I didn't move. 10 more minutes. Past, a car drove by slowly, tires crunching over fresh snow. The driver gave a quick nod and wave. I nodded back. Tried to smile, but my face felt stiff. There was no explaining what I was doing, no polite way to say I had been invited, but not expected. I stood another 5 minutes, then 10 more. The cold worked its way into my bones, deep and slow, like grief that didn't need words. The front porch light flickered once, then steadied. Still, no one came. I shifted the bag to my other hand. It had started to feel heavy from behind the curtain. A movement, I couldn't be sure, but something stirred inside a shadow, a shape. Then it disappeared. I rang the bell one last time. Not in anger, not even in hope, just in quiet finality. Then I stepped back, down to the sidewalk and waited. I told myself I would wait 5 more minutes, just 5. After all I had said I would come, and I had, even if no one was opening the door finally opened. Garrett stood there with a look that was neither welcoming nor annoyed. Just blank, like he had stepped into a room and forgotten why he blinked twice. Then said my name more like a reminder to himself than a greeting. I nodded and lifted the soggy gift bag. He didn't reach for it, just stepped aside. Inside, the warmth was immediate. The scent of pine and cinnamon hung in the air, thick and sweet. Lights blinked across the tree in the corner. The living room was full, eats draped across the backs of chairs, drinks half finished on the mantel, shoes kicked off near the baseboards. I could hear someone laughing in the kitchen. A child darted past with glitter stuck in her hair. Nina appeared from the hallway. Her lipstick was perfect. She wore a cream sweater dress and gold earrings that sparkled under the pendant. Light, she glanced at me, then smiled just enough. "Oh, we thought you might not make it. We got caught up with everything." She didn't take the gift bag either. She motioned toward the dining room and turned, already mid-con conversation with someone behind her. Garrett gestured vaguely toward the front closet. So I hung my coat. There myself, the hook was loose. I had tightened it. 3 years ago, back when they first moved in. Back when I still carried a small toolkit in my purse, just in case they needed something. The dining table was full, 12 seats, all taken. A folding chair had been added at the very end, tucked half into the walkway that was mine. I knew without asking. I slid into it and placed the gift bag on my lap. My knees brushed the edge of a plant stand. The album inside the bag bent slightly under the pressure. No one asked about my drive. No one mentioned the snow. One woman across from me smiled politely, then turned back to her conversation. I tried to listen something about ski reservations. Something about someone's new kitchen backsplash. The food arrived in heavy dishes. Ham, green beans, mashed sweet potatoes. It looked lovely. Nah. Moved through the room with practiced ease, refilling glasses, laughing at just the right moments. Garrett sat 3 seats away. He caught my eye once and nodded, then looked away when dessert came. I reached for my bag, thinking maybe now would be the right time. Maybe someone would ask what I brought. But the moment passed, the conversation never slowed. The space around me stayed untouched. I set the bag beside my chair. Someone asked Nina where she got the glacier. She said it was a wedding gift from Garrett's aunt. I had bought that set. She didn't mention that. I swallowed the rest of my coffee and smiled when someone passed me a dish. I held it steady as they served themselves and never looked my way. The lights shimmered overhead. My chair wobbled slightly on the uneven tile. I adjusted it with my foot and said nothing. I had been let in, but I had not been. Welcomed after dinner, the kids were sent into the den with puzzles and cocoa. The adults stayed behind, lingering over pie and decaf. I stayed in my folding chair, quiet hands folded on my lap. The gift bag was still beside me, unopened. I watched Garrett laugh at something Nina said. His posture was easy, relaxed, the kind of comfort that comes when a man believes the room belongs to him. I remembered that same curve in his shoulders when he used to collapse onto our old couch after football practice. But now, the boy I had raised had been replaced by someone with carefully measured gestures and polite detachment. Na's niece came skipping back into the room. She couldn't have been more than 7. She looked at me with a squint, like trying to place a face she couldn't quite remember. Then she turned to Nina and said something in a stage whisper. "Is she the cleaning lady? Like Miss Janice at my school, a few?" Chuckles followed, soft and uncomfortable. Na laughed the loudest, then waved her hand like it was nothing, just a kid being silly, but she didn't correct her. Garrett said nothing. I sat very still. I didn't correct anyone either. Not because I agreed, but because the room didn't feel like mine anymore. I had been invited, but not expected. Present, but not seen. Someone started clearing plates. Nina leaned toward Garrett and said they should set up the dessert station in the kitchen. He nodded and followed as they walked away. I heard her mention getting a cleaning crew for next time. My name wasn't said, but I felt it float in the silence that followed. I stood and gathered the gift bag. The contents had shifted slightly inside the jar, tapping against the edge of the album. I didn't open it. I didn't offer it. I placed it gently behind my chair, out of the way, like something someone might find later, and wonder, who left it behind? A soft hum of music played from the living room speaker. Someone lit a new candle, vanilla and cedar. I walked to the hallway and looked at the framed photos on the wall. Yes. Family beach trip, Garrett in sunglasses holding Nina close. Their daughter in her dance costume, all recent, all polished. There were none of the old ones. None of the baby pictures I had taken, none from our old backyard. Not even the high school graduation where I stood in the front row, cheering louder than anyone. It was as if I had been gently erased. I returned to the table just as Nina brought in a tray of tiny cheesecakes. She smiled at me, soft and vague, like someone greeting a distant cousin. Garrett avoided my gaze. I sat back down. No one asked me to share a memory. No one asked what I had brought. The evening unfolded without a single thread tying me to it. I had always known families could grow apart. I just hadn't realized mine had done it while I was still in the room when the dishes were done and most of the guests had left the house. Thinned out into quiet, I stood near the hallway, unsure whether I was expected to stay or go. No one offered a blanket. No one mentioned the guest room. Garrett was helping Nina stack leftover containers, and neither looked my way. It was late. The wind had picked up outside, swirling snow against the windows. I cleared my throat softly and walked toward the den. There was a small pull-out sofa in the playroom, not a real bed, not even a guest space, just something the kids used for movie nights and sleepovers. I had seen it once when I dropped off a box of old books. Nina never acknowledged. The sofa creaked as I sat down. I pulled off my shoes and folded my coat over the armrest. There was no pillow. The only blanket in reach was a fleece throw printed with cartoon dinosaurs. I lay down slowly, knees bent, and pulled the blanket to my chest. The lights were dim, but I could still make out the shelves along the wall, plastic bins of toys, a globe with missing countries, a finger-painted family tree where my name was not included. I lay still and stared at the ceiling. Years ago, I used to work the overnight shift at the hospital. Kitchen, 14 hours on my feet, trays upon trays of soft food and weak coffee. I would come home just before sunrise, aching, and still make Garrett's lunch before he left for school. It never felt like sacrifice. It felt like love now in this house. I helped fund with quiet generosity. I was sleeping on a sofa meant for toddlers. No one had even said good night. I closed my eyes and let the ache in my hips anchor me to the room. This is temporary, I told myself, just for tonight. But it felt like more than that. It felt like a line had been drawn while I wasn't watching, a line that said, "You were once needed and now you are simply here," like a lamp left plugged in, too sentimental to throw out, too outdated to use. A door clicked somewhere in the house. Then silence again. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the whir of the furnace kicking on familiar sounds in an unfamiliar space. I thought of the gift bag still behind the chair in the dining room. Maybe someone would find it tomorrow. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe it didn't matter. Anymore, I turned on my side, clutching the thin dinosaur blanket. My eyes stayed open for a long time. It had taken a lifetime to build this family. And just one night was to realize I had been written out of it. Morning came slowly filtered through the thin curtains in the playroom. I sat up stiffly, rubbing my shoulder where it had pressed against the edge of the sofa all night. The blanket had slipped to the floor sometime before dawn. My back ached and my neck had a tight pull from sleeping, curled too tightly in too small a space. The house was already stirring. I could hear Nina in the kitchen, her voice low but steady, probably giving Garrett instructions about packing leftovers or sorting the recycling. There was no rush in their movements, no urgency. It was a normal day for them, just another morning after another holiday. I folded the dinosaur blanket and placed it neatly on the sofa, then slipped into the hallway. Garrett was at the counter pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He looked up when he saw. Mian hesitated, then he smiled soft but rehearsed, like someone greeting an acquaintance at the grocery store. I stood there, unsure if I should wait for something more. Na appeared behind him, holding her phone, already dressed, already polished, Garrett said. They had been thinking there was a senior community not far from here, just a few minutes out of town, spacious. Private, they had driven past it once and thought of me. He said it would be perfect, quiet, but not isolated. I would have my own place, my own space. Freedom, he called it. Independence. I listened. Nina nodded along, supportive, helpful. She said it was about making sure I had comfort, that I deserved peace. The words came smoothly, practiced like a pitch. They weren't asking, they were directing gently. It was not cruel, it was polite. But it was clear they no longer saw me as part of this house. Not even in the corners I had become an item to be placed, to be positioned somewhere they could feel good about a solution. A checked box, I smiled. Thanked them for thinking of me. Garrett looked relieved. Nina returned to scrolling her phone. No one asked Shude how I slept. No one asked what I had hoped for when I came. I took my coat from the closet, the hook still loose, and slipped it on the hallway mirror. Caught a slant of light from the window. I barely recognized the woman in it. Pale, quiet, smaller than she used to be, but the eyes. The eyes still remembered everything I told them. I would think about it. Garrett offered to email me the brochure. I nodded. Then I stepped out into the cold. My car waited where I left it, dusted with snow, alone at the curb. I sat inside for a moment before turning the key. The house behind me didn't shift, no curtain moved, no door cracked open. It was done. They had made their suggestion, and I had heard it loud and clear. The road home felt longer than it should have. I drove in silence, the heater wheezing against the cold. My fingers were stiff on the steering wheel. The sky hung low, the kind of gray that swallowed. Sound and color, everything looked like it had been dipped in ice water. The cabin stood just where I left it, quiet, steady, surrounded by pine trees, heavy with snow. It was small, but mine bought years ago with the overtime pay I had saved, tucked away for weekends that never quite happened. Now it would be more than a weekend escape. It would be a return to something I hadn't named yet. Inside, the air was still. I turned on the lamps, lit the fireplace, and slipped into the wool slippers, waiting by the door. The wood creaked under my feet as I walked to the small kitchen and put on a kettle. My hands moved without thought, finding the tea. Eggs in the drawer. The same brand I always used. There was no voicemail from Garrett, no follow-up text, no email with brochures. I wasn't surprised. I pulled the financial folder from the cabinet above the sink. It was old, worn along the spine, thick with papers and notes. I had written to myself. I opened to the page marked in red. The house Garrett and Nina lived in was still under my name. I had kept it that way because I thought it would make things easier, thought it would feel like a gift, a foundation for them to build on. I never once imagined they would try to build something without me on it. There were other papers, too. Bank account access, college savings for their daughter, automatic payments for their utilities. I had set up years ago and never thought to cancel. I had called it helping. Now I saw what it had become. I sat down at the table with a pen. I made a list. Then I picked up the phone. First, the bank. I closed the credit card tied to their account. I removed Garrett's name from the educational fund. The woman on the other end asked if I was sure I said yes and meant it. Then I called my lawyer. The house would be transferred into a private trust. Not for them. For something better, for a community fund that would help retired nurses. Women like me who had worked quietly for decades and ended up just as quietly forgotten. I would keep the cabin my. Name my quiet? It wasn't revenge. It wasn't spite. It was clarity. Outside snow began falling again, soft and slow. I watched from the window, the cup of tea cooling in my hand. My reflection in the glass looked steadier than it had the day before. For the first time in a long while, I was not waiting on anyone to make space for me. I was claiming my own. The cabin had always been a place of quiet. Not the lonely kind, but the kind that lets your thoughts stretch out over the next few days. I filled the silence with action. I made more calls. The property title was signed over to a nonprofit that supported retired caregivers. The lawyer assured me it would take effect by the end of the month. Garrett and Nina would be notified then, not before I canceled the automatic transfers I had set up long ago. Their heating bill, the internet, little things I had been paying out of habit long after they stopped noticing. I called the financial institution handling the college fund and froze it. That one took longer. Had to answer 3 security questions each one, reminded me how much of their life had been built from my fingerprints. Then I printed the new documents. They sat on my dining table, heavy with finality. My name's still there, their name's gone. It didn't feel like revenge. There was no bitterness in my chest, only a strange calm, like closing a door that had been left open too long. Letting in wind and cold, Garrett called 2 days later. The tone of his voice was tight. He didn't mention the house or the accounts directly, just said that something had come up, and he was wondering if I had made any changes. I told him yes. He paused. He asked if we could talk about it, I said. There wasn't much to discuss. I had thought about the offer he and Nina made, the one about the senior home, I told him. I had declined it, not because it wasn't nice, but because I no longer wanted to be placed anywhere. I would rather choose my own space. He sounded confused, then a little annoyed. He said things were just getting complicated, that Nina was stressed that the mortgage was due. I stayed silent. He asked what had changed. I said nothing had changed. I had just stopped pretending. He didn't reply right away. I could hear him breathing the way he used to when he was a boy, and knew he was wrong but didn't want to say it. Then he said he understood, but I knew he didn't. Not really understanding would have come years ago when I stood outside his door in the snow when his daughter mistook me for help. When Nina set out place cards with my name missing, this wasn't about punishment. This was about recognition. I had spent decades pouring everything I had into a family that no longer saw me. Now I was pulling that energy back, not to hurt them, but to remember myself outside. Snow gathered in soft piles against the porch. I stepped outside with my tea and stood still as the wind swept past. This place was quiet, but it was no longer empty. 3 days passed before Garrett called again. This time his voice was softer, less clipped. He asked if he could stop by with his daughter. No details, just a visit. I said yes, not because I wanted closure. I had already begun building that myself, but because I was curious what version of himself he would bring. The son who once reached for my hand crossing the street, or the man who had stepped aside while I stood outside his door in the snow. They arrived just before noon. The snow had melted into slush along the gravel drive, and their car crunched to a stop near the porch. I stayed seated at the kitchen table. I didn't rush out to greet them. I let them find their way in. Garrett stepped in first, carrying a paper bag. He looked around the cabin like it was a stranger's home. His daughter trailed behind him, clutching a sketchbook. Her cheeks were flushed, and she smiled when she saw me. Though shyly, we exchanged hellos. I offered them tea, and Garrett nodded. No one said much as I filled the kettle. The silence wasn't heavy, just unfamiliar, like we were all adjusting to a room that had shifted shape. He handed me the bag. Inside was a loaf of banana bread and a small jar of honey store-bought. Still, the gesture felt like an effort. I thanked him. We sat at the table, steam rising from our cups. He looked older to me than he had last week. His eyes were tired, not from age, but from something heavier. He didn't bring up the house or the accounts or the trust. Maybe he had nothing to say that wouldn't sound like pleading. Instead, he said, "Things had been overwhelming. Na's job. The mortgage, the holidays." I listened. He said he missed how things used to be, that he wanted to find a better way forward. I nodded. He didn't apologize, but he said he hoped we could talk more often, maybe share Sunday dinners again. He said it like an invitation, but also like a favor. I told him I needed time, that I wasn't angry. I just wasn't willing to disappear anymore. He looked down, nodded, and placed his hand over the cup. No. Attempt to hug. No request to stay. His daughter drew quietly at the end of the table when, They stood to leave. She handed me the paper. A sketch of a cabin, a woman in a red coat standing outside, a small fox curled at her feet. I smiled and thanked her. Garrett looked at me like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. He stepped outside, held the door for her, and they left. The embrace never came, and I didn't wait for it. Some distances cannot be walked back with words. Some silences must be respected. In the quiet that followed, I pinned the drawing to the fridge and poured another cup of tea. The air inside the cabin felt unchanged, and yet something had shifted, not between us, but within me. Snow blanketed the lake in a quiet hush. From my window, I watched as wind swept across the surface, carrying wisps of powder like breath across glass. The trees stood heavy with winter, tall and unmoved inside the cabin. It was warm, the kind of warmth that comes not just from fire, but from decision. I sat at the table, writing, not letters, not journals, just small thoughts, as lines that floated into my head and needed to be kept. I had started doing that lately, not for anyone else. Just for me, a quiet collection of things I never gave myself space to say out loud. There was a knock at the door that afternoon. Gentle, not urgent. I opened it to find Carol, my neighbor from across the lake, older than me by a few years, soft eyes, strong hands. She lived alone, too, in the small green house near the trailhead. She held out a tin of cookies and said she was gathering a few women from the area. Retired nurses, former caregivers, women who had raised families and now spent their days in the hush of the woods. They met every Thursday at the rec hall for tea, maybe a walk if the weather allowed. She said, I would be welcome. I thanked her and took the cookies. Later that night, I sat by the fire and read the small flyer she left Lantern Women. That was the name of the group. Something about that stayed with me. Lanterns, quiet sources of light, not loud, not blazing, just steady. The next morning, I bundled up and walked across the trail. Snow cracked beneath my boots. My breath came in small clouds. When I reached the hall, the door was already open. Laughter inside, not loud, but full. I stepped in. Carol smiled and waved me over. No questions, no introductions, read aloud. Just space at a table, a mug already poured, a chair waiting. I sat down. There was a woman at the end of the table knitting, another sorting old photographs. One was scribbling on a notepad. They didn't try to make conversation right away. They didn't ask for stories. It felt like arriving at a place where you didn't need to explain yourself for a moment. I thought about Garrett, about the years I had measured my worth by how needed I was, about the silence I had mistaken for peace. I let that go. I stayed for 2 hours. When I returned to the cabin, the air felt lighter. Not because anything had changed outside, but because I had chosen to take up space again, not as a mother, not as a caregiver, just as myself. I opened the tin of cookies and made tea. Snow fell steady through the trees across the lake. A light flickered on in Carol's house, and I did not feel alone. Winter settled deep into the trees. The lake froze solid, a pane of quiet glass stretching wide under the pale sky. I lit a small candle each evening at the same hour. It wasn't a ritual I planned, it just happened, a simple way to mark the days, a quiet reminder that I was still here, still choosing this life. I rewrote my will that week, not in anger, not as punishment, but with intention. Garrett's name was not included. I left the cabin to a fund that supported aging nurses with no family. The remainder of my savings would go to scholarships for daughters of single mothers pursuing caregiving professions. Not because I owed anything, but because I finally understood about where my legacy belonged. There were no tears when I signed the papers, no hesitation, just the steady hum of the pen gliding across the page. Later, I sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, hands curled around a mug of warm cider. The snow fell soft and even brushing the windows, the railing, the ground. The world felt hushed, but not empty. I didn't think about Garrett much anymore, not with bitterness, just with distance. There was a time when his approval had been the measure of my worth, when I believed that to be loved meant to be indispensable. But now, in the hush of this cabin, I knew better. Being needed is not the same as being seen. I chose now to be both. The candle flickered on the windowsill. Outside, the pines whispered as the wind moved gently through their branches. I closed my eyes. This I thought was peace, not the kind that comes after conflict, but the kind you build slowly alone with your own hands, the kind that does not beg to be noticed, but endures anyway. And that was enough. If this story echoed something in your heart, maybe something you've lived through in silence, I hope you know you're not invisible. Sometimes, reclaiming your voice means walking alone for a while, but in that quiet there is clarity. If you've ever been left out in the cold, may you find warmth not in their return, but in your own. Becoming. Let me know how this story sat with you, or just sit here with me a moment longer. We don't always need to speak to.